Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I guess it depends on where you are in the world. Welcome to the Mental Health Hour. I'm Dr. Tapo. As I always say, it's just great to be here, to be able to spend this time with you. Um, it's summer here in Canada. I have friends like in South Africa who've been complaining about the cold because it's winter over there. So, wherever you are, I hope whatever weather, whatever climate you have to um, live through, that you are at least doing well, especially mentally and emotionally, and you have everything you need to go through that season, right? We always talk about seasons in life, and often we use those, or that rather, that analogy when we're talking about things that happen in our lives as we grow, as we mature, as we experience different things. But here I'm talking about the actual seasons of weather and climate and of the year, and just kind of thinking about people who are in different situations. We know that in some parts of the world there are hurricanes, there's flooding, there's different what we call natural disasters. So wherever you are, I hope whatever your weather is, that at least you are doing well. If it's extreme, if it's harsh, if it's a lot, I hope you're coping well. So, the mental health hour is an opportunity for us to just kind of reflect on where we are mentally and emotionally. Uh, we all have different stresses in life, different things that we go through. We have different responsibilities. And so this is the time that we have to just kind of take a deep breath, sit back and reflect, look at where we are, um, self analyze, and just kind of self care as well. Like we talk a lot about self care here on the Mental Health Hour. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for taking this time to listen. Before we go any further, just a reminder that the Mental Health Hour is for educational and informational purposes only. So it's for education and information. We don't diagnose here. We offer information, we offer suggestions, but it's really up to you to go out there and get the help that you need based on your situation, based on where you live, based on the law and regulations in your country, in your nation as well. You can text or call 437-778-3299, 437-778-3299. You can also email infolovebay@gmail.com to share some of your thoughts, some of what's been going on for you. We always love to hear from you. It's great when we know where you are in the world and you're listening in, you're sharing your experiences, you're asking your questions, you are maybe even offering suggestions. But let's remember that is all that is, suggestions. We do not diagnose and we don't treat, but we offer information so you can go and get a proper diagnosis, can go and find proper treatment for your condition or situation. A few weeks ago, we started talking about suicide, because we had a couple of people write in and talk about their experiences with suicidal ideation, which is that idea when it first enters your head. We call that ideation, right? It's still an idea, it's more of a thought. You haven't tried anything, you haven't attempted anything. And from ideation, we move into attempts. And then from attempts, we actually see people, unfortunately, sometimes succeed. And we just want to intervene with information and suggestions, so that it doesn't go that far. So we started talking about suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts. And if you know someone, maybe it's your child, your parent, your spouse, your partner, your best friend, your neighbor, whoever it is, and you're worried about them, and maybe you suspect that they might try suicide, like, what do you do? What do you say to them? And as a reminder, this is not something you beat around the bush. It's not something you approach with the, it's also not something that you want to be rough about or confrontational or whatever. But it's definitely not something to beat around the bush. You have to ask those questions directly, using the right words and language. So you will actually ask, are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about ending your own life? Are you thinking about harming yourself? Because you want to be able to intervene before it's too late. So if you ask things like, are you okay? It's very easy for a person to say, yes, I'm okay. But when you ask them more directly, are you thinking about suicide? They will, maybe they still can lie, but they will more likely offer a little more information, or you will be, depending on how well you know them, you'll be able to garner or read them and find out a little bit more. But if you're not direct about it, it's a lot easier for people to hide those intentions. And it's those very intentions that we want to intervene on. So be direct, be kind, be compassionate. It's not a time to start talking to people about you have demons, this is the devil, and all of that. Right? It's not a time for pointing fingers or blaming and dismissing and being rough. It's a time to be compassionate and direct about the risk, right? It's the same thing if you suspect somebody might be doing harmful drugs, drinking excessively. I think one of the things we talk a lot about stigma, right? And because of the stigma of some of these things, we don't talk about them like we're supposed to, because of stigma. And sometimes it's also because we're afraid. We're afraid we don't have the capacity. Like if somebody does, you ask them, are you thinking about suicide? And they say yes, and you don't know what to do. So you're almost afraid to ask because you're not sure you have the capacity to support them, to help them, to intervene in any way. So I would suggest that you do your homework first before you ask that question. Do some research. Okay, so if my loved one admits that they've been thinking about it, maybe they even have a plan. Because remember, I said we ask them, are you thinking about? If they say yes, or they say, like, I don't want to talk about it, like, whatever it is, the next question to ask is, do you have a plan? Because you want to know how far they've gone in that ideation, right? Sometimes it's just a thought that comes during those high stress moments, and they manage to kind of dismiss it and carry on with their day. But sometimes it's gone on longer, and now those ideas just kind of stick and hang in there. So now they've gone beyond the it would be better if life was over, to how can I make it happen. So they're now in those planning, they're now in that planning stage, and those emotions of just feeling absolutely hopeless. And we talked about how sometimes, now that they have a plan, they've made that decision that it's going to happen, they might actually become elated because they're seeing an end in sight. So the way you ask these questions, the way you approach these questions is really important because you need to know where they're at, right? So do your research. What resources are available? If something happens, do you call the police? Do you call the ambulance? We all live in different countries, and unfortunately, there are some countries where healthcare is not where other countries have their healthcare. It's not at the same level in some spaces and places. You can't call an ambulance. You have to figure out what to do, where to go. You don't even have a helpline, right? And then in some countries, you do. You can call a helpline, and there's somebody at the end of the line who will sit with you, talk with you, and kind of, as the expression goes, talk that person off the ledge. But depending and based on where you are, before you ask that question, figure out what you can offer in terms of resources, in terms of supports, phone numbers, places to go, people to talk to, that type of thing. If you're maybe in a place where you don't have the same types of healthcare and supports for somebody who might be experiencing that suicidal ideation, do they go to church? Is there somebody there at church that they can speak to? But again, I really, really have to emphasize that it is not the time to try to be casting out demons. It's unfortunate that sometimes in our churches and in our religions, we tend to see everything as a devil that needs to be cast out. Now, I'm a believer, I've said this before, and yeah, we can cast out the devil, but you don't ask a person, are you thinking about suicide? They tell you yes, and then you start casting out demons, because I guarantee you that will not help. That will not help. If we follow even the example of Jesus, he wasn't casting out demons left, right, and center. For everything there's a demon, right? So let's be sensitive rather than being religious. So the person has admitted, what supports can you offer? Make sure that the person you might refer them to is also equipped and has the capacity. So don't say, let's go speak to the pastor at church, and then you arrive there and the pastor starts casting out demons. That is not the right approach. Pastor can cast out demons once you have left or once or whatever. I'm not saying demons aren't involved. I'm sure there's demons out there whispering suicide, but that is not the approach to take. You want to provide a space where this person can speak openly and honestly about their struggles. And together you come up with what we call a safety plan. And sometimes that's the best and only help you can offer in these situations. Somebody tells you, like, I have $300,000 debt. I lost my job. My car broke down. My wife left me. One kid is headed to jail. Like, you cannot solve all those problems. But what you might do with that person is sit down and say, let's think of a safety plan. If you're feeling like you're close to the edge, you have no hope, you're feeling like the best way or thing for me to do is to end it all. How do we keep you safe until that passes, until you're in a position to address and face some of these challenges in life? Because the thing is, nothing is permanent, right? Including our pain, our trauma, our situations. You can find out today that your spouse is leaving you. It will hurt like very, very badly. A month later, it's a little bit better. A year later, maybe you've already met someone, you've moved on. But the day it happened, you felt like your life was over. And so the point of a safety plan is to help that person go from that pain, that devastation and pain. You want to try and buy them time, right? They're feeling devastated, rock bottom, whatever it is, absolutely hopeless today. But you're trying to buy them time because a month later, things may be different. A year later, things will be different. So you're trying to buy them time because if you let them respond to what they're feeling in that moment, if they're feeling hopeless and like there's no way out and this is the only solution, what you're trying to do is let's keep you safe until we find other solutions. Let's keep you safe until it doesn't hurt as much. Let's keep you safe until we can figure this out. So you're trying to buy them time. And what's the best way you can do that? So that's what you need to figure out before you ask that question. And then you ask that question, and you already have some ideas of how you can support and help them. So when you go for therapy, like I've said before, as therapists, we'll ask those questions. And if somebody says, yes, I'm actively thinking about it and planning for it, we then engage a safety plan. And what it is who can you talk to? So if these feelings of desperation and hopelessness suddenly become overwhelming at 2 a.m., as a therapist, I'm not living in your house, so I'm not there for you to call 24/7. So who else can you talk to at 2 a.m.? What supports do you have at 2 a.m.? Right? So that's a safety plan, and you want to help your loved one figure that out. If you are available and you have the capacity, be part of their safety plan. If you're feeling like this, call me anytime for the next few weeks. I will not turn my phone off when I go to bed. So anytime you need to call me, call me. Make sure you say these things. Why? Even by just that gesture, right, of saying, I usually turn my phone off, but because I know what situation you're in and how delicate things are for you right now, I won't turn my phone off. Isn't that comforting? Like already you're providing a support system. And when they do call, it's not so you can tell them like, no, you're overreacting. Or we have a tendency as human beings, and sometimes sadly I feel like for us people of Black or Afro Caribbean descent, we just really are too hard on ourselves and each other. We do not allow space for the suffering person to express their suffering. I mean, sometimes I think about it when little kids are crying and we tell them, stop crying, stop crying. Before you even know why they're crying, you're already telling them, stop crying. And it becomes something cultural, right? Your little kid is crying, you haven't even asked them why you're crying, you've already told them, stop crying, wipe your tears, I won't listen to you if you're still crying. But you don't know why that child is crying. So let's not be quick to try and stifle or erase and dismiss people's suffering. If a child is crying, first find out before you tell them to stop crying. And if they can't speak because they're crying, let them cry. We actually know that crying is good for the soul. It's good when people are feeling anxious and sad. They need to cry. They need to cry because after that crying, they actually feel better. Research shows crying is necessary. So let's stop telling people to stop crying. If somebody needs to cry, let them cry. And then give them space to articulate what's going on for them. So if you're part of that safety plan, please do not volunteer to be there for someone and not be there for someone. You tell them, call me anytime. They call you 2 times, 3 times. You don't pick up, or you pick up and say, I'm busy right now. Can I call you later? And you know what situation this person is in. If you cannot and do not have the capacity, do not sell yourself as a support and then not support a person, because that actually makes them feel worse when they dial that number or send you the text or look for you and they can't find you in a moment of desperation. It makes them feel even more alone. So don't volunteer yourself. If you don't have the capacity, do not. Help them find somebody who does. Help them find somebody who, if they dial the phone, that person will pick up and speak to them and give them space. Sometimes maybe they need a place, sometimes we'll say, come and stay with me for a while. And it's just being in a different environment. Somebody's cooking for you. Like for me, some of the hardest moments in my life, the thing that I really appreciated most was when people cooked for me. Because it's just that knowing that, okay, I'm not in this alone. I don't have to over explain myself. I don't have to defend that I am feeling low, I am feeling desperate, I am feeling hopeless. Let's not push people to defend things that they're struggling with. A struggle is a struggle. There's no one has the right to minimize somebody else's pain. Sometimes people will say things like, if I say I'm hungry, then say, well, you should be grateful at least you are hungry and can go to the fridge. There are people with no fridge to go to. That doesn't make me any less hungry. There can be 10 million people without a refrigerator. I am still hungry. So you telling me I should be grateful I actually have a refrigerator, there are people with no refrigerator, I'm still hungry. Someone not having a refrigerator does not in any way and should not in any way minimize the fact that I am hungry. But we tend to do that as well. We tell people don't cry. And then when they're in pain or hurting, we want to make them feel ashamed or guilty because their situation is not as bad as so and so situation. And why do we compare? Why do we do that? Why do we compare? Validation is something that we and we've talked about self-validation in the past, right? We've talked about you as a human being need to be able to validate yourself. And sometimes the reason why people don't have that ability or capacity for self validation is because they've just always been dismissed, invalidated by the people who should be nurturing them to the point where they can self validate. We've talked before about even self esteem. We want to tell kids that they should have self esteem, but you're the very same parent who's always criticizing them, dismissing them, ignoring them, punishing them, doing all these things. And then when their self esteem doesn't develop, we criticize them again. It's the same with validation, right? Here's somebody who's suffering to the point of wanting to take their own lives. And the people around them are telling them they're overreacting, they're selfish, they're immature, they're this, they're that, they're that. It's like being punched when you're down already. But validate their feelings. And by validate their feelings, I'm not saying you'll say, yeah, if I was you, I would also want to end my own life. That is not validation. That is reinforcing. But validation is helping them figure out that you're not alone and your feelings are valid, but you just don't have to act on them. So while those are your feelings and that's what you're struggling with and that's what you're going through, how can we keep you safe? How can we start to look for even solutions? And that's the other thing. So I gave the example of somebody who's $300,000 in debt. Their spouse has left, they lost their job, one kid is headed to jail. And those are things that maybe you're in a position to give them $300,000, great. But a lot of times we can't solve the other person's problems. But sometimes we now want to start telling them, did you do this? Did you try that? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? I was speaking recently to a young woman in therapy, and she said she tried to talk to someone about what was going on for her. And she said, like, everybody has an opinion, everybody has a solution, and nobody is listening. Oh, you should just do this. And that's how we say it. Like, it's the simplest thing. Oh, you should just do this. Well, why don't you do that? Have you thought about? And we're so busy expressing our thoughts, our opinions, offering unhelpful solutions, when really all we needed to do in that moment in time is listen. Listen, just listen, until they're in a position to start thinking about solutions. Then maybe you can offer some of your suggestions. But even then, be careful that you are not, what's the word I'm looking for, patronizing, trying to make them look stupid for not, because the thing is, when you hear about a situation, I'll give this example. You're driving your car on the highway, and now there is, let's say there was an accident in front of you, you're stuck, and you're on the phone with someone, and you're telling them, I'm stuck on the highway. And then that person, what will they say? Oh, why don't you take the next exit? You just said you're stuck on the highway. Well, take the next exit, or make a U-turn and turn around. And you're the one who's stuck. And do they really think you didn't look around and see, is there an exit I can take? Is there any way I can make a U-turn? You've done all that. And you're reporting, I'm stuck on the highway, to somebody who starts telling you they're not in the car with you. They can't see what's happening around. They're telling you, do this, do that, do that. At some point, you get so frustrated, you hang up. Because that's what we tend to do. We're not in that situation, but we're throwing out these solutions, but they're not actually solutions. And it's frustrating for people who are struggling. I hear this a lot from people with depression, from people with anxiety, when they try and explain, whether it's to a family member or whoever, that right now, and people are, well, you just need to shake it off. Well, why don't you exercise more? You're not sleeping enough, and blah, blah, blah. And it is frustrating. It is demeaning and undermining. It is dismissive. We need to learn to listen more and stop throwing these so-called solutions into situations we are not in, we do not fully grasp, and have not experienced. The first thing is learn to listen. And if you are a good listener, this person is likely to be more honest about their suicidal ideation. They are more likely to buy into any type of safety plan. And the safety plan is not for you to decide everything. It's for you to discuss with the person and co-create. You are simply facilitating. They need to decide, because at the end of the day at 2 a.m., you're not going to be the one dialing the phone for them. They need to be part of that planning, buy into that planning, and commit to that safety plan. So it's not for you to tell them what to do. Oh, the next time you're feeling that, do this, do that, do that, do that. No. So these are just some things to be mindful of and aware of, so that we can be more helpful in a constructive, firm, and stable way for people that are experiencing trauma, experiencing deep and difficult, challenging mental health problems, people who are in desperately stressful situations. First port of call, learn to listen. Second, if you do suspect that there might be some suicidal ideation, do your research. If they do say yes, what resources are available? Again, it's not that so you tell them next time you're feeling this, call that. Offer them. Or I was thinking about you, and because I thought you might be going through this, that maybe there's suicidal ideation, I just brought some of these resources for you. This is a helpline you can call. This is somebody you can talk to. This is a place you can go. I hope that's helpful. When you show this validating respect for what they're going through, they are more likely to open up to you. They're more likely to share what's going on, and they're more likely to accept and use those resources that you offer to them, because you're showing them that you're not looking down on them. You're not thinking they're stupid or weak for feeling this way. You're not dismissing them. You're not swooping in and acting like the savior and all of that. But you are respectfully saying, I care about you. I know and understand you're going through a hard time, and I just want to help in whatever way I can. You're helping to buy them time, so that at some point this intense period will pass, and they'll be in a better space, in a better, even like mentally, to be able to tackle some of those things. Now, something else that people sometimes confuse is self-harm. So when we talk about self-harm, we are talking about a different thing from suicidal ideation. Okay. So self-harm is something we see quite often, especially in young people and especially in girls. And this is not to say older people don't self harm, because they do. It's not to say males don't self harm, because they do. But it is more common amongst teenage, adolescent, young adult women. And what self harm is basically is when a person deliberately injures themselves or hurts themselves, so that they are inflicting some kind of damage or wound to the body. So you might see somebody who has scratches on their arms. Maybe you're seeing, and it's usually in places that are convenient but hidden. You might see that over weeks you're seeing new scratches, new wounds, new cuts regularly over a period of time. They might stop wearing, for example, if they're self-harming on their arms, they might stop wearing short sleeves and always be wearing sweaters and covering up those places where they're self-harming. They might spend a lot of time alone, especially when something challenging or difficult is going on. So research shows, for example, grief or loss, the death of someone close and important in their lives may trigger self-harming behavior. So Self-harm is not the same as suicidal intent or ideation. The objective of self-harm really is to cause one physical pain. So we're not talking about tattooing, we're not talking about piercing, we're not talking about, for example, eating disorders. There are other conditions where some people pull out their hair when they're stressed and frustrated. That's not what we're talking about. These are also self injurious behaviors, but they're not necessarily self harming. Self harming is that self mutilation, it's not suicidal, it is deliberate, it is basically self abuse, and it is self inflicted violence. So these are some of the words that are used in defining self harm. So there might be some similarities between suicidal attempts rather than intent, actual attempts. The thing is, self harming is more frequent. So a person can actually self harm absolutely every day, but they're not attempting suicide every day. Self harm is usually the most common is the cutting. So they might use like a safety pin. They might use any sharp object that they can use to cut their skin, to break the skin, to make it bleed, to make it swell. Burning, so using matches or a lighter or cigarettes or whatever, even radiator, whatever it is that will again inflict that pain deliberately. And it also includes self hitting. Some people will bang their heads against the wall until they're dizzy, until they're bleeding, until they pass out. That is self harm. And the wounds are often what we might say superficial, in that the person is not trying to cut deep enough to like maybe cause the vein to bleed. They just want that skin to break. So very superficial, like surface type stuff. And the reason, research shows the reason why people self harm is to as a way to distract themselves from emotional and mental pain. So a child has lost, let's say, a parent, their mom, their dad, grandparent, whoever it is, or even a sibling, somebody they really loved, really, really close to, and they are feeling overwhelmed by the grief and loss. So they might start cutting. And what that does is that pain distracts them from what they're feeling. They can now focus on the physical pain. So again, the intent is not suicidal. The intent is to distract from mental and emotional pain, from stress, from some of those feelings of desperation, frustration, uncontrollable anger. So you might have that child when they're angry, they start banging their head against the wall, they start trying to harm themselves. That is self harm because they're overwhelmed by the rage and the anger. They'll start hurting themselves. So that's self harm. And a person can have been self harming for a really long time and you'd never know. So, what do you do when you find out somebody is self harming? First of all, you want to make sure that if they're cutting and burning and there's some open skin or whatever, that there's no infections, right? No infections. Take them to the doctor. The doctor will examine those physical wounds. Again, the hope is that the person hasn't gone too far. It's all superficial, will heal. So you just want to keep it clean so it doesn't get infected. But also by taking them to the physician, you are helping them get the help that they need, like in terms of if it's depression, if it's some other mental health disorder, then they can get properly diagnosed and you can get the help that they can get the help that they need. So sometimes people self-harm because they don't know what else to do. They're not trying to kill themselves, but they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling desperate, they're feeling all these things. And the only way they feel they can respond to what's happening is through self harm. So, again, similar to someone who might have suicidal ideation, you want to ask them directly, have you been self harming? Have you been hurting yourself? Try and have that conversation. What resources can you offer? How can you support them? Do they need someone to talk to? Therapy has been shown to be very effective around self harming behavior because therapy provides them a space to kind of work through those emotions that are overwhelming them. Self harm can escalate to suicidal behaviors, especially when a person becomes desensitized. They've been self harming for a while and now it's not working. And those overwhelming, difficult, challenging emotions, depression, whatever it is, still hasn't abated. They might escalate into suicidal behaviors. So it might be that they started self harming and now they're thinking the best way to end this once and for all is to take my own life. So just because somebody is self harming doesn't mean we don't ask those questions around suicidal ideation, because you want to know. You've discovered that they're self harming, ask that question. Have you thought about ending your own life? Have you had suicidal ideation? Have you attempted? I think sometimes we're afraid to ask because we think we're putting things in people's minds, we're giving them ideas, and that's not the case. That is not the case at all. So, again, self harm, the intent is not to die, it is to distract, to displace the pain so that instead of it being mental and emotional, it's now physical. With suicidal ideation and attempts and intent, the intent is to die. They have come to that decision that I need to end my life. Self harm might escalate to suicidal attempts or intent, but not necessarily. And the best way to figure out what's going on is to have an open and frank conversation. And the way to make sure that it's open and frank is to listen, not judge, not reprimand and lecture and cast out demons and start telling stories. Oh, you had an uncle who was the same way, or your cousin from your mother's side was like that also. And that is not the time and the space. You want to provide that person space to talk. So listen so that you know where exactly they are, what are the risks, and how much you should be worried. And you can't figure all that out when you're telling them what to do, what to think, what to feel. That is not the way to respond. So if you find out that your child, because it's more likely to happen in adolescence, so early, let's say preteens, late preteens rather, into adolescence, young adults, that's where we see a high rate of self harm, more so with females than males. But males also do it. And the thing is, when males do it, it is often a lot more violent. So, like the banging their heads against the wall, uh, um, just seeking out more potentially harmful ways of self harming. The same way as males are more likely to attempt suicide in a lot more violent ways compared to women. Right. So, like I said, cutting, burning, self hitting, those are the three most common types of self harm. Um, Girls aged 14 to 17 are more likely to be hospitalized for self harm compared to boys. So, like I said, there's higher rates of self harm amongst teen or adolescent girls compared to boys, but boys also do it. And girls tend to cut more often, while males are more likely to burn themselves or hit themselves. And then I have a statistic here that I found rather between 2013 and 2014. So, in a year, and these are the numbers we do know, and we know that often a lot of people fall through the gaps. But in 1 year in Canada, 2,500 teenagers or young people aged between 10 and 17, 2,500 in 1 year were hospitalized for self harm here in Canada. So 2,500 between the ages of 10 and 17 were hospitalized for self harm. That means they were cutting themselves, they were burning themselves, they were hitting themselves, or some other form of self injury or self violence. As young as 10. And I've been in this field for a long time, but it always shocks me when we're talking about 10-year-olds being diagnosed with anxiety, with depression, self harming, even attempting suicide. We've seen that a lot. And we're seeing the numbers increase over time because one of the main reasons is social media. We can actually see that with the introduction of social media in a young person's life, their mental health suffers. So, to those of you who are parents out there, we know that kids will often say, but my friends are on social media. We don't want them to feel left out. We want them to feel grown. But if you, as an adult, think about it, I've heard lots of, even today, I had lunch with a friend who was talking about social media causes her anxiety. She's a grown woman, even has some children that are young adults. And she talks about how social media impacts her mind. What's on the news, what's on Instagram, what's on YouTube, on TikTok, on all of this. If you have adults suffering due to social media exposure, why give your 10-year-old access to something that they are not yet old enough or mature enough to be able to know, I need to stop this, it's not good for my health? We're not giving kids cars to drive at 10. There's so many things. Even at 10 years old, we're saying kids are not old enough to have sex, give consent for sex at 10. But we're giving them social media because it's on a phone that they can carry, because they know how to log in. Like, it is harmful. And we're seeing high rates, and those statistics are from 2013 to 2014. I'm sure if we look for statistics now, they've probably doubled or tripled because we're seeing it in so many other spaces. Higher rates of anxiety diagnosis for children, higher rates of depression, higher rates of self-harm, higher rates of suicidal ideation and attempts for small children, 10 years old. So we really need to think about some of the things we're exposing our children to. If they're not mature enough for most of the things you're doing as an adult, they're probably not mature enough for social media. And as a parent, you should know, is my child ready or not? It's not up to the child to decide if they're ready. It's up to you as the parent, really. Because you can ask an 8-year-old, are you ready to drive on the highway? They'll say yes. But are you going to put them in the car, give them the keys, and say, go for it? No. I think we minimize and underestimate the damage that can happen on social media. Higher rates of bullying, even because it used to be you go to school, you see your bully between 9:30 and 3 p.m. After school, you're free until the next day you go to school to see the bully. Now the bully is on social media, they're everywhere, there's no escape. And we're handing these harmful environments to children who cannot protect themselves, who cannot limit themselves. They can't say, like, no, I'm only going to do 10 minutes on social media, then I'll get off. They'll be there as long as it's available. They're not sleeping in the middle of the night because they have their device. I've known some parents who take the device at bedtime because they know that if I don't take it, this young person can be up all night on social media. Who are they following? Who's following them? Who are they communicating with? What content? I read something the other day where someone was saying in their feed, because it's algorithms and all of that that determine what goes into your feed, and they actually had a huge fight with their spouse because the spouse looked at their feed and there were all these half-naked women, and the man was insisting, no, I don't look at those things, I don't understand why my feed is full of them. But he just woke up one day and he had all these explicit images, that type of content coming to his feed. So we really need to think about what can bring a child as small as 10 to the point where they're cutting themselves, they're burning themselves, they're hurting and harming themselves. Get them the help that they need as soon as possible. And it starts by listening. What are they sharing? And also, what are they not sharing? And sometimes you can't figure out what they're not sharing because you're full of your own ideas, your own opinions. You want to tell them what they should think and how they should. And so you don't actually listen and hear what it is that they're saying or not saying. And so your intervention doesn't work. We really do need to think about what we're exposing our young people to. Because as we said, the intent of self-harm is not suicide, but it can escalate. And what research is finding causes it to escalate is at some point, I mean, if this young person started at the age of 10, self-harming, by 17, they've probably moved on to suicidal ideation. because the self-harming doesn't work anymore. They've become desensitized. They've been doing it for a long time. It might escalate. So we need to understand what is happening in the minds of our young people, of our loved ones, what is increasing their risk of suicide, of self-harm. The same way we also need to know, recently I got an email from a young woman, and she's only 16, and she said she started doing drugs, she started having sex, and she knows that these are things she should not be engaging in, but she just felt so alone. She started trying to find ways to deal with it. And then when her family found out, they beat her. They beat her, they beat her, they beat her, they took her phone, they beat her some more, they punish her, they now make her do all the cooking, the cleaning, because she has nothing better to do. If you weren't so, you wouldn't be doing this, you wouldn't be doing that. And that is not taking away those feelings that brought her to the drugs and the sex. Yes, these are behaviors we don't want to tolerate. These are behaviors, yeah, sure, we want to punish them and all of that. But that punishment hasn't solved the actual problem. It hasn't addressed whatever it is that made her feel that the drugs and the sex with some boy from her school, and that's the other thing, they changed her school, so now she has no friends, she's in a new environment, no phone, no. And remember, the thing in the first place that got her into some of these things was loneliness, and now she's even more isolated. But if they stop to listen, and listening doesn't mean you're saying those behaviors are okay. Sure, you can still discipline them, but the discipline has to make sense. Like beating a 16-year-old, like really. Now her one intention is to get out of that house and never come back. This is how we sometimes find young kids living on the streets, living in shelters like here in Canada, but they have family, they have people. And we really need to be more sensitive and not just beat, not just punish, not just discipline, but listen, ensure their safety. I started talking to her about safety, like, like with drugs. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in contact with a family whose 30-year-old daughter died from a drug overdose. We know a lot of the drugs on the streets right now are laced with harmful uh, chemicals, fentanyl, all of this, and people are dying. And Black kids are dying from fentanyl, cocaine, other types of overdose. But we act like it's not happening in our communities. So there's safety in terms of drug use and alcohol use. There's safety in terms of sex. STIs are on the increase here in Canada, higher rates of chlamydia and other STIs because people are not using protection. Young people are not using protection. They're thinking, well, we're both 16 years old. We haven't slept with anyone. We must be clean and safe. Teen pregnancy, unplanned pregnancies. So there's so many risk factors. And then on top of that, you're beating that child, which is also unsafe. because you could hit them, they could fall, they could bump their head, they could break something. Safety first. So, as a parent, if your child is engaged in any type of risky behavior, the thing is not to risk their safety even more by beating them, because that's unsafe. Start by ensuring their safety, then getting them the help that they need. But you need to be able to listen so they can tell you everything they've been doing and get the help that they need. If your immediate reaction is to beat them, all they're going to do is become really, really skilled at hiding things and doing things behind your back. For this young woman, she just felt desperately lonely. Desperately lonely. And now in a new school, no friends, no phone, no anything, constantly like this never ending punishment. This happened like 2 months ago, and up to now, she's still serving punishment. That home has become an unsafe space for her, and she's suffering. So a young person might start self-harming, a young person might start thinking of ending her life. Because she actually did use some statements that for me made me question suicidal ideation. I just want this to end. I feel like there's nowhere for me to go. This will never end. I just want this to end. So, to parents out there, for sure, discipline your kids, but don't beat them at 16. I've always said you beat a 2-year-old because maybe your words don't quite make sense and you don't want them sticking their little hand in the socket. So you might just, and not even beating, like just don't ever do anything to your child that can be labeled beating at any age. So you might slap a little kid's hand to show them, like, no, 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 that's harmful. Don't touch that. But if you're still beating a 16-year-old, like, come on. You've been beating them since they were 6, since they was, I don't know, 6 months old. Now they're 16 and it's obviously not working. Try something else. At the end of the day, try something else, because the physical violence is not solving anything. I can tell you, for this young girl, they can beat her, which they have been. It has solved absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. At some point, you have to listen and sit down and sit in the discomfort and fear and whatever it is, that you would rather beat a person than actually admit that as a parent, I'm afraid for my child, or I'm angry at my child, or whatever it is. But instead, you beat your child so you don't have to face your own emotions. That has to change. So I'm looking at the time. Our time is up, Love Bay family. I'm wishing you a wonderful rest of the week and rest of the month of June. If you're in those wintry seasons right now, to folks in Southern Africa and wherever else, we're sending you warm feelings. If you're on this side of the world, and some of us are experiencing heat waves and that, stay cool. Have a wonderful week. Take care.